Rookies are fun, but undervalued veterans can still win you fantasy championships. We discuss why older vets such as Alvin Kamara, Cooper Kupp, and Aaron Rodgers might still have enough juice in the tank for the upcoming season on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk. When I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL.com.
I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL, fantasy betting, and now draft and free agency, all that good stuff for the offseason for sportingnews.com.
Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. It's Eclipse Day, Vinny. And with Eclipse Day, I know some people are very, very excited, especially if you're in the direct path of it. And I'm sure it'll be super cool. But with taking that into account, we wanted to have some fun with fantasy football today. So we're looking at these older veterans. And will these guys, are they about to eclipse into obscurity? Or do they have sunny days still ahead? Now, that's the question, right? So we're going to start off the bat here with two aging veteran running backs, Alvin Kamara and Austin Eckler. With Alvin Kamara, he finishes the RB, 3 last year? Now, it was a large gap between Christian McCaffrey, Kyren Williams, and Alvin Kamara. Still the running back 3, will be 29 years old here shortly. Do you still think he has anything left in the tank to still be a top 10 running back next year?
Yeah, unfortunately, I just don't want to invest too much into him at this point. I mean, they're changing what they're doing offensively there a little bit, and it's been a good run, but I think he's had a lot of wear and tear recently, and he's had a lot of touches. Keep that in mind. Since he started in the league, he was consistently, catching 81 balls? That was like the first 3 seasons, and those add up, right? You're still taking hits. You're still getting the open field. You're getting tackled, and I feel like he's been around forever. I can't believe he's only 28. Like, it seems like Alvin Kamara, I've been using him in fantasy for a lot of years, but we know there's that Kendre Miller factor. He's floating out there. We knew Jamal Williams was an iffy threat to his workload, but going forward, how much do they want to trust Alvin Kamara? And look, it's been a good run, but I think this offense will open it up a little bit more and take advantage of the wide receivers and really kind of spread the field a little bit more for Derek Carr. So I don't know if you're going to get that volume in the passing game that we're used to with Alvin Kamara. He's not exactly a power runner who can hold up. Kendre Miller has a pretty good body to do that. So I'm not sure exactly what you're going to get from Alvin Kamara, but I think we've been expecting the fade here for a couple years. He's just not someone you want to go bang the table and go chase, right? I think he's a guy that has some intriguing value. You might look at him as an RB2 once all these guys are off the board, but you're not going to say, yeah, I'm going to target Alvin Kamara in a lot of drafts. It's just very shaky at this point. So I think the wear and tear, the history of injuries that have come up of late, and he played through them, and he's played through them pretty well, but it's going to get harder as he gets older and the volume is really piled up. So I think the eclipse time is here, and Kendre Miller might be the guy blocking him. They might find someone else there that works out. But I just don't see Alvin Kamara being a worthy investment. And if someone wants him as an RB2, go ahead. But I think I'm going to pass in that situation, go with someone with greater upside.
Yeah, the interesting part is I think if he stays with the Saints and they end up not cutting him for whatever reason, they can save so much money. I can't believe they would want to stick with Alvin Kamara, but he's still on the team. So if he's still on the team for 2024, I will say I still think there's at least one more year of sunny days ahead. And it's just because of the targets that he sees. And I know those declined a little bit, but they didn't really add anyone. If anything, they lost Michael Thomas, haven't really added any other pieces in the passing game. So I still think he would get enough targets. Now, his efficiency went down so much last year as a receiver. He always was super efficient as a running back for a receiver, right? Always upwards towards 9 yards per reception, which is fantastic for a running back. dropped all the way to 6.2 last year. So was that his age? Was it the scheme? Was it Derek Carr? I'm not sure. But if he's on this team, he's still going to be the lead back. He's still going to get enough targets to be relevant. And like I said, he ended as the running back 3 in fantasy points per game last year. Do I think it gets that high? No, but he could still be a top 10 running back, especially in PPR leagues, if he were to stay on the Saints. And earlier in the offseason, the new OC Clint Kubiak did say in his new scheme, he hopes that boosts Alvin Kamara late in his career, blah, blah, blah. That's this coach speak.
Yes.
I could still see it happening for him. In terms of Austin Eckler, though, I think Eclipse is here. It's happening. It's done so for him in terms of like elite ceiling finishes for him. He finishes running back 21 in fantasy points per game last season. And so much of his production over the last couple of years have come from targets and touchdowns, so many touchdowns. And with him competing with Brian Robinson Jr., being on a team with who knows who the quarterback will be, it's going to be one of those rookies. I don't expect them to score all too much. And then he's just going to get so much of the workload taken away from him with Brian Robinson Jr. Yeah, I think his glory days are over.
Yeah, and he might know that as well, right? I mean, look at the contract he signed. He just took a deal, and everyone was kind of surprised. Oh, he just doesn't really try for more money like we saw with Saquon Barkley or Josh Jacobs, right? They kind of pushed toward their market value. Tony Pollard accepted a little less than that, but Alvin Kamara, based on what the Chargers are paying for him, he just took a bargain deal with the Commanders. Now, we talked about the Commanders and their offense with Cliff Kingsbury spreading the ball around quite a bit. So they did lose Curtis Samuel, but I think they'll probably look for a replacement target, not only there, but also at tight end. So they're going to diversify this offense. The main two guys are Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. And now you have Zach Ertz in the mix there. So you could have two tight ends cutting in to what they're doing. And they're going to find that third receiver that they can rely upon. So Cliff Kingsbury has been a spread it around type of offense here. We have seen James Conner and some others have good years under Kingsbury, but I just don't think Eckler can hold up as well. He's had a lot of hamstring issues, soft tissue, things that have popped up of late. He's really been worn down, just like we mentioned with Kamara catching all those balls. I mean, there's been a lot of touches, even though you don't see them in the running game. You've seen them pile up in the passing game. He's been used like a wide receiver. I mean, he's pushed 100 receptions. So you know that's a lot of work. It just comes from a different avenue here. So when I look at it, I just can't go there. He could surprise us all. We know that. But I think, as you mentioned, Michelle, the biggest obstacle here is Brian Robinson Jr. because he is a good scorer. He's a pretty good pass catcher. I think he's a little underrated. We thought Antonio Gibson was better there, but we know Gibson didn't really do much, and he is now gone to the Patriots. So it could be some weird hybrid role of what they lost in Samuel and what they lost in Gibson. And that's not a big role that you can carve out of this offense, especially when it's transitioning to a new quarterback and a new system. And if you add, say, they opt for Jaden Daniels over Drake May, then you got a running quarterback. They're not going to check down as much. They're going to steal yards there with the groundwork. So there's all kinds of factors that are working against Eckler. I think Drake May, if he's the draft pick, it would help Eckler a little bit. But keep in mind, Drake May is a pretty good athlete as well, and he could run. So I'm just not feeling it here with Austin Eckler. And I think we're pretty much in agreement on this ever since we saw him fade with the Chargers here late last season.
Yeah, and especially the contract, considering what he got, just not very much at all. And you brought up a great point. It does make a difference, a slight difference in terms of his ranking for me in full PPR leagues, if it's Jaden Daniels or if it's Drake May. If it's Drake May, I may up his targets a little bit. Maybe he will be somewhat relevant as a PPR guy. If it's Jaden Daniels, that even knocks him down more. Like, a mobile quarterback, the leading running back in targets at LSU last year had 14 receptions all season long. It's not going to be a great situation for him, I don't think, either way, but Jaden Daniels would make it much worse as we're just counting on targets there. And we're going to get into now wide receivers in our next segment and their targets. Will they go down next year? With talking about Cooper Kupp and Stefon Diggs. Now, I actually feel really good about one of them, and I think he will be on my team in a lot of leagues because his value will be low. I'll tell you who that is. Is it Cooper Kupp or Stefon Diggs? We'll get to that right after the break. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by the Game Time app. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. I personally use the Game Time app so many times, whether I'm going to a comedy show or when I lived in Pittsburgh and I wanted to buy tickets at the last second for the Steelers games, or if I'm downtown in Houston and I want to hit up an Astros game. I always know I can count on the Game Time app. You can rest assured that you will always get the best price with Game Time, because if you find tickets in the same section in a row for less on another app, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. They also have your back, unlike other ticketing platforms, because if an event is canceled and not rescheduled, you will automatically receive a full refund for such event. Also, they allow you to return your tickets within 24 hours from time of purchase for full credit to your Game Time account with no questions asked. Take the guessing work out of buying tickets with Game Time. All you have to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account on the Game Time app and redeem code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Stefon Diggs switching teams. He's going to the Texans. You and I haven't even got a chance to discuss this yet because you were on vacation in Italy. That was a wild trade, right? So let's start with Diggs here, and then we'll get to Cooper Kupp. Diggs last year ends as the wide receiver 14 in fantasy points per game in full PPR leagues. He's turning 31 years old, but not till November, so he's still only 30 for most of the season. But we know the decline we saw in the second half of last year. Now he's changing teams to the Texans. So instead of getting those 160 targets, where might he be? I envision his targets are going to go down by a bit. Let's get your thoughts on this Stefon Diggs trade, because we haven't got to hear them yet.
Yeah, as you can see with the Texans, there's not a lot of vacated targets here, right? I mean, they brought back even Noah Brown in the slot. We know they're looking at an extension for Nico Collins. You got Tank Dell. You've got even Dalton Schultz back in the mix. We weren't sure if they were going to re-sign him at tight end. You have Joe Mixon for some checkdowns out of the backfield. And you got some other lingering dudes right on the bench, like a John Mechie and some people they've held on to for a while. And they still could look to draft a receiver sometime. They have a ton of draft picks at this point, so they could just add a guy with some upside, maybe for the slot, if they don't see Noah Brown being a long distance thing. Now, my question is, where exactly are they going to play Stefon Diggs? Like, is he really the number one? Is it Nico Collins? Is Tank Dell going to take over? This one was a weird move to me just because I think the Texans were pretty loaded. It seemed like they just kind of helped out the Bills. The Bills wanted to dump a contract, and they were ready to take him. I just don't know where all these targets are going to open up. And unfortunately, if he is relevant, he's going to come at the expense of one of our two favorite guys here, Collins or Dell. Like, I don't know. Like, I think they're taking a shot on him to maybe expand and help those three receiver sets for CJ Stroud, where you don't have to put Noah Brown on the field. Now he's relegated to backup, I would guess, based on the size profile, that Tank Dell would be in the slot, right? Or Stefon Diggs could also do that. So maybe interchange Diggs and Dell as the inside guy. Nico Collins, I think, pretty much based on his size and profile, has to play on the outside pretty consistently here for CJ Stroud. So maybe they're looking at Stefon Diggs as just an upgrade over Noah Brown and just giving them a little bit more punch there in those three receiver sets. And you got Dalton Schultz. So I just don't see where the production comes in. Like, we know with the Bills, what was his deal? He was getting targeted a ton because Gabe Davis was fading. They didn't trust Khalil Shakir totally. Here, I think CJ Stroud is going to be on the same page with all these other guys that he's used to, right? Now he's getting used to Stefon Diggs, and the process has started late, right? It's April, so he's not even had the early time of the offseason where we've had with the free agents and throwing on the side. Like, they're going to have to play catch-up really fast to develop some chemistry. So I think Diggs, the fade, I think was pretty obvious. It was right in front of us. And I think it's happening here. This is the really bad situation, I think, for Diggs to continue his value, especially as a fading player. So I'm not feeling it at all here. I think it's eclipse time for Stefon Diggs, and they've got two young receivers to do that.
I think I agree with you that it's eclipse time for him, but also at the same time, I want to give the positive side, right? Like, so I do
Mm.
think his targets are going to go down by a significant amount because he was the only guy on the team for the Bills for the majority of those 4 seasons that are really earned those targets. I will say last year, so we know weeks 1 through 6, he was going off. And then teams really did start to play him differently on defense because they realized, you know what, we really don't have to worry about Gabe Davis all too much, right? And they didn't really have anyone else to make defenses all that scared. So they were like, we're going to just bracket Stefon Diggs. And everything he was able to get was short because he couldn't get open intermediate anymore because they were bracketing him. So his catch percentage went down to 61.3 from week 7 through the divisional round when it was up over 74% the first 6 weeks. His yards per reception went down to 9.4 again through week 7 through the divisional round. It was up at 12.7 prior to that, which is normally his average in his career, the 12 to 13 range. 9.4 is really stupid low for him. I envision with the Texans and all of those weapons, they can't bracket him anymore, right? They're going to have to focus on all these weapons. His catch percentage is going to go way back up into the 70s again. He's probably going to average maybe a career high in yards per reception with how much space he's going to have. So, do I expect the targets to be close to what he had at the Bills? Absolutely not. But I do expect his efficiency to skyrocket. So maybe that's where maybe he's down to 120, 130 targets, but maybe his yards per reception skyrocket and we see a really nice season from him there. And then also he leads the league in downfield touchdowns over the last 4 years at 30 touchdowns, downfield touchdowns. That's 10 plus air yards. We know Stroud and that offensive system, they're pretty good at that, right? So I do think that Diggs could have some really nice weeks. It's probably just going to be inconsistent with Collins getting his, with Tank Dell getting his weeks, and then Diggs as well.
Yeah, it's just going to be really hard to read that offense from week to week, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
again, who's the older guy that has less experience with the quarterback? It's Diggs. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm just looking at him. I think, like you said, he's a bit of a luxury player for them. They're going for it. Obviously, with CJ Stroud on the rookie contract, trying to go after a Super Bowl title here. And that's what you should do when your rookie quarterback is ahead of schedule and do that. So he could be a designated big play guy. He's never been a real short area touchdown guy, so he's going to be a little bit dependent on those big plays. And Nico Collins can stretch the field as well. So it'll be interesting to see how Diggs fits in or what their plan is. And we'll read more about it as we get through the other parts of the offseason, mini camp and training camp. We'll get some better reports there on the beat to see how they're getting along, how they're using him. And that might give us a little bit encouragement or discouragement, one of the two. Now, the other player that we put on the list here is Cooper Kupp. Now, Cooper Kupp is a tough one. He kind of reminds me, throwing it back a little bit, to Sterling Sharp, like a guy that was awesome for a few years and then injuries set in and that was it, right? He didn't have that enough of a spike to be kind of a Hall of Fame candidate. Like he was excellent when he was on his best years, right? I mean, he was otherworldly. He should have been MVP of this league based on his numbers. But look, he's also had a share of injuries, multiple knee injuries. Last year was a bummer, just couldn't stay healthy, and then opened the door early for Puka Nacua to have his big breakout rookie season. So, and the other thing that you look about the Rams, Michelle, is I think maybe we have to potentially consider a quarterback transition here. Matthew Stafford could continue to fade here a little bit. He had a nice rebound season, but it was still middle of the road fantasy QB last year. They could be looking at Michael Penix or someone in the draft to kind of line up here behind Stafford. So I think you probably have some better feelings toward Cooper Kupp. So I'll let you start with those and I'll rebut there.
Yeah, so I still think I know the injuries are a little bit scary, but I have good feelings about him in this upcoming season. He's turning 31 years old, so I think he has one more good year in him. I'll say that with Matthew Stafford still having probably one more good year with him. This is kind of the Rams' last ride with this group of guys. But last year, like you brought up, I mean, immediately he hurt his hamstring right in the beginning of August in training camp. He was out, then he comes back and re-aggravates it right before the season. So he misses the first 4 weeks of the season. And then in November in week 9, that's when he sprains his ankle. So really, he didn't have very many games he played last year healthy. And there was really only 3 healthy games he played with Stafford last year because 2 of those games prior to him getting the ankle injury, Stafford didn't play because he was, or for 1.5 of those games, Stafford was out. But I mean, we have to remember in those first 2 games he played 118 yards, 148 yards. Week 7 was bad. Then Stafford was out. And then after that, he sprained his ankle and he still had some good games spread in there as well. But weeks 5 through 17, Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua didn't have that different of targets. Nacua saw 102 targets. Cooper Kupp saw 95. So those are the games that they played together. And there was 7 target difference. And that's with Kupp playing with a sprained ankle for the majority, a big chunk of that time. So I do think the targets are going to be much, much closer next year than people want to realize with Nacua and Kupp. Nacua is going very early in drafts. I am a little bit worried about it. It was Kupp that led those 2 in receiving touchdowns during the games that they played together. Obviously, Nacua was a bit more efficient with his targets, with the yards per reception, and he still probably will be because he's younger and he has more juice left in the tank. But I think Kupp still is heavily involved in this offense. It's probably going to go through these 2 guys mostly. They're both going to see a ton of targets. Kupp is really good at scoring touchdowns. I think he's going to be a great value in drafts this year.
Yeah, I'm going to call this a partial eclipse, not a total eclipse, but I just look at Cooper Kupp and I think on one hand, you're right. Everything you say about his role, and there's not a lot of competing targets in this offense, right? They can't consistently find a third receiver. The tight end is hit or miss with their usage. Kyron Williams is pretty much a dedicated running back, right? They don't use him too much in the passing game. So these are the 2 guys that are going to throw to a ton with Stafford on the field. So the volume is there. I think the biggest question, again, is staying healthy. And that's a tough one to trust at this point. I mean, it really is. When you have that much behind you, 2 major knee injuries, last year's couple injuries here, he just has seemed to never shake these, right? He had the one healthy year where he was awesome, but they just kind of creep in there all the time and linger around him. And I think after a while they pile up. They do affect another thing, right? He had the knee, so he was compensating, and then he was doing this, and you injured something else. So I'm just a little bit worried. Like, I think he has potential, but he's not going to blow the doors off, right? He's never going to be the Cooper Kupp from a couple years ago when they won the Super Bowl. That's not going to happen. So you have to decide where's the risk reward balance here, right? If Puka Nacua is higher, I agree with you. Nacua should not go as high because there's still Cooper Kupp. He still exists, and that while he's healthy, you can't bump up Puka Nacua into like the top 12 at wide receiver quite yet. I think you can feel confident about it. Maybe you see him going in the top 6. I think that's way aggressive for him at this point. So when you look at Kupp, if he's healthy, he's going to do what he does, but at a lower level. He's never going to reach that peak that we saw. You also have Nacua and Kupp. They kind of run interchangeable routes. So they could make Nacua the alpha, right? And take away some of the things that Kupp did well previously because, again, he's a slower player at this point. Nacua is more explosive. So that's what you could look at as well. So it's a tough one. I think you're right. If his value comes down to a wide receiver 3, then I'm interested. He's a good shot to take. But if people are still thinking he's going to be Cooper Kupp of old, or someone's looking at his wide receiver 2, it's not, again, another player that I'm not necessarily targeting, much like Alvin Kamara.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. And to finish up our show, we're going to talk about Aaron Rodgers, old man Aaron Rodgers. We're talking about old players here. Is he the oldest one in the league? I think he is, at least on offense here. So Aaron Rodgers and then Dallas Goedert, because it was a brutal year for Dallas Goedert last year. And do we think he's going to jump back into it and be a good fantasy option? Maybe, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it should be interesting. And Aaron Rodgers, we'll see about that. All right, this episode and show is brought to you and sponsored by BetterHelp. And BetterHelp is your source for the best therapy you can get online. And it can be tough this time of year. And maybe it's helpful that we see spring and we've managed to get out of winter, but we still could be in a bit of a fog inside our heads, and we need some help to get back on track here. And it's important to say, hey, there's some help out there for us. And if you haven't given online therapy a try, I would strongly suggest it. I go to a therapist consistently to kind of get me back on track. If I'm a little bit off the rails in my head, I can just get going to where I need to go and find my roadmap to the right direction in my brain. So I really cannot speak enough about the benefits of therapy in my life going forward. And I've been attached to a therapist for a long, long time. And really, I would suggest that this is a great time to get in on it here because BetterHelp is the right place to try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So you know the fit is right for you. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp. BetterHelp, HELP, betterhelp.com/locked on. All right, Michelle, we will get to our last two players that we're looking at a maybe potential total solar eclipse for their careers in 2024. Let's start with the juicy one here, Aaron Rodgers. He's 40 years old, so maybe the sun should have already set. He's coming off a torn Achilles. What do you think we're going to get from him in his really true first season with the Jets?
I know. So maybe the eclipse settled in last year on the first drive of the season for him when he tore his Achilles, because I think that's the hardest part, right? So in 2022, we see him have a absolutely terrible fantasy season, finishes the quarterback 24 in points per game among quarterbacks with 5+ starts. It was just very useless for fantasy. And then that was after two really good years for fantasy, right? In 2021, quarterback 6, in 2020, quarterback 4 in points per game. Can he get back to that? He does have better skill players than he did in 2022 right now because he has Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams and Breece Hall. We'll see if they add another skill player in the first round of this draft. But for him to be a good fantasy quarterback, because he's not going to be mobile at 40 years old with Achilles injury, he's going to have to put up at least 35 passing touchdowns. Like I'm talking about, like to be a really good fantasy quarterback, not just average and a streamable guy. And does he have, I know I just brought up the weapons, but does he have enough weapons to get him to over 35 passing touchdowns? And does he have a bad enough defense where he has to do that? Like, I think they're just going to lean on the defense and the run game and then use Aaron Rodgers when they need to. Do you agree with me with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was their plan last year that Aaron Rodgers is going to help them be competent and efficient on offense. And they were absolutely the total opposite of that with Zach Wilson. They just weren't efficient. They relied a lot on Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall making big plays. If they didn't make big plays, they didn't win games because they didn't score enough. So, I don't see this offense suddenly being explosive and just going to a 25 to 28 point per game basis. I just don't see that at all because Robert Saleh is the coach and he's going to think defense first. And they're going to think about, okay, how are we going to win games like 20-17? And that's maybe what they're looking at now in a lot of these cases. And if the Jets can hold up with their offensive line, I mean, that's another question we've gone into the season with. We're not sure how they're going to be up front, even with Tyron Smith in the mix now. So, and they're taking chances here. Tyron Smith is a guy who's a little bit older and has broken down a little bit with injuries. You also have Mike Williams, who is a little hit or miss with his availability. And you don't necessarily have that reliable guy with Alan Lazard or Randall Cobb that really has emerged there, someone familiar with Aaron Rodgers. So I don't know, like how much can they get going here? The one thing we didn't see from the Jets is just Breece Hall being steady in the running game because some of those offensive line issues also crept into that part of their offense. So I'm not sure if they want to be a run heavier team here with Nathaniel Hackett. We've seen this go in that direction as well. Keep in mind the first year with Matt LaFleur and Hackett there in Green Bay, what was it? It was a lot of Aaron Jones scoring touchdowns. They won a lot of games, but they were leaning a lot on the running back and the defense. So that definitely could play out again. And he's older. And we can't just assume he's going to be awesome from the Achilles after, as Michelle pointed out, his fading seasons before then. And now he's added another year. We don't know what his mindset is. It's just very confusing to me. And I think everything considered here, you just don't need to go after him. There's just too many other guys. So just don't go after the name. I mean, I think in a weird way, I think I'd rather have the bargain of Russell Wilson a little bit later, right? Because he's got some weapons and he's maybe in a comfortable spot and he can run a little bit to give us some value where I don't see that with Aaron Rodgers. So really, if it comes down to Aaron Rodgers trying to take him force him in as a back end QB1 or take Russell Wilson as a bargain QB2, I'm going with the latter.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. You want to believe in Aaron Rodgers, and like you never want to say he can't throw 40 touchdowns because we've seen it so often from him. But it's really hard to envision 40 years old coming off Achilles. Like he has to be the next Tom Brady to do it, right? Tom Brady's the
Yeah.
only guy that we've seen in his 40s have those type of seasons. So he's going to have to be the next Tom Brady if that happens. Now to finish up the show, I have one tight end to ask you about. Dallas Goedert finishes as a tight end 12 last year in points per game after finishing as a tight end 5 in 2022. So down year last year, but it was really a down year for this entire Eagles offense. I'll say he did have a career high 83 targets last year, and he missed a couple of games as well. 59 receptions, also the highest. Is just his efficiency was so far down, only at 71 catch percentage after being at nearly 80% the year prior. At 10, he only averaged 10 yards per reception last year when he was at 12.8 in 2022, 14.8 in 2021. I do expect his catch percentage to increase and his yards per reception to increase again. I think this Eagles offense gets back on track, maybe not to what they were in 2022, but I do think they're much better. Moved on from their OC. Now they brought in Kellen Moore. We'll see if he can fix it. Do I think Dallas Goedert has super high ceiling even in any week? No, he doesn't have that high ceiling. He only has 8 games with 15 plus fantasy points in PPR over the last 3 seasons. But I do think late in drafts, he's a solid enough guy that I would be interested in going with him if I'm punting the position. I think it'll be better than it was last year.
Yeah, I've just never been high on Dallas Goedert because he's a tight end that I can't really trust to score. And then you'll see, oh, he'll break out for a big game once in a while and he'll kind of pad his stats and he'll ride those numbers for a few games and he'll show up again. But he's not a guy that they target in the red zone. He's getting up there a little bit. 28. I mean, it's not that old, but I just don't see him being as big of a factor in this new offense. Keep in mind, they also have Saquon Barkley, who's going to change maybe their philosophy of not throwing to the running back, which they've not done as much. So he could easily end up as the third busiest guy behind A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith here for Jalen Hurts. And then we have the running quarterback into play here. And it's Eagles offense again. I mean, Kellen Moore, we've seen the seasons with Dalton Schultz and Dallas, so there is potential there at tight end. I just don't think they use Dallas Goedert in the same way. He's like solid, but he's not someone I'm going after. I'm not going to say it's totally eclipsing what he's done before, but I just don't see it, right? I just don't see it in this offense where the targets may be there, but he needs a lot to get it done. Like it's very hard to watch sometimes if you have him. You're like, oh, he's really struggling to get to 6 catches for 43 yards or something. And then one game he'll have a 30-yard play and get 3 catches for 100, and we go, oh, that's why I drafted him. But like, it's just very hard. It's a roller coaster that I don't want to be on. And we've also talked about all the rise of the younger tight ends, right? Trey McBride is in the mix with the numbers that we saw from the main guys. Travis Kelce didn't slow down. We saw in the playoffs, George Kittle and Mark Andrews. These guys are still in play. And then you have the young guys, as we mentioned, McBride. Some of us think Kyle Pitts could rebound here. So there's all kinds of availability of different guys. Like if I wanted to go higher end, I could find somebody. If I want to go lower end, I can find someone. So I don't know. Dallas Goedert, it could be just, it may not have anything to do with age or anything, but I think I'm just off Dallas Goedert. He's just not, I don't like to target those middle tight ends, right? Like an Evan Ingram type. I just don't want those. I want somebody with upside later, or I want one of the reliable ones. And I think that comes into play no matter what age he is.
Yeah, and Goddard definitely doesn't have the upside. I don't see that there.
Yeah.
Unless, when Devonta Smith goes down, if that ever happens, we have seen Goddard. That's kind of when his targets increase, but he kind of needs an injury for that to happen. So I understand why you're saying that. So maybe the sunny days are behind him. That is it for today's show. Thank you to you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Every dayers, I'll be back, and Vinny will be back tomorrow to talk more fantasy goodness. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.